Aniello Joseph Dellacroce was born March 15, 1914 in the Little Italy section of Manhattan. As the name would suggest, Little Italy was home to a large population of Italian immigrants. A mass immigration from Italy to the United States had taken place in the late 1800s, and many of them who arrived in New York settled in the few block radius around Mulberry Street. At the time of Dellacroce's birth, the Little Italy section of Lower Manhattan was overrun with crime and poverty. The Black Hand, which was a method of extortion practiced by organized crime groups like the Camorra and the Sicilian Mafia, was active in the area and used violence and intimidation to shake down many of the businesses in the neighborhood. His parents were Francesco Dellacroce and Antoinette Vecchione, both Neapolitan immigrants from San Paolo Belsito, Italy. He had an older brother named Carmine and an older sister named Lucy, and he was raised in the building across the street right behind me at 232 Mulberry Street. In Italian, his first name Aniello means little lamb, and his last name Dellacroce means of the cross. He grew up across the street from the spot which would one day be known as the Ravenite Social Club. Just up the block from Dellacroce's home on the corner of Mulberry and Kenmare Streets was a popular mob hangout named the Alto Knights Social Club. The who's who of the mob could be seen there discussing business, such as Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese. Many of the original big players in the early New York Mafia roamed Mulberry Street, such as Giuseppe Morello, Ignacio Lupo, and Joe Bonanno. Dellacroce worked as a butcher's apprentice in his teens, but growing up in the impoverished and heavily mobbed-up area in Little Italy, he would be influenced by local mobsters and take to a life of crime early on. His criminal activity started in his teens, and at age 16, Dellacroce was sentenced to 2.5 years at Elmira Reformatory for a store burglary conviction. Upon returning from jail, the young Dellacroce continued to build his mob connections as well as his reputation in the streets. He now went by the name Neil, a shorter anglicized version of the name Aniello. In 1937, Neil was arrested again and pleaded guilty to assault and was sentenced to 6 months in prison. In the late 1930s, the young hood had come to the attention of the Mangano crime family, which was headed by boss Vincent Mangano. Mangano was one of the founders of the original 5 mafia families in New York City. Dellacroce became associated with the Manganos and would soon be inducted as a made man into the family. Also part of the Mangano family was the man who would one day become the boss of bosses, a young and savvy gangster named Carlo Gambino. Carlo Gambino's cousin, Paul Castellano, was also part of the Mangano family. Paul Castellano also happened to be Carlo Gambino's brother-in-law, as Carlo Gambino had married his own cousin, Paul Castellano's sister, Catherine. Vincent Mangano's underboss was the ruthless Albert Anastasia. Anastasia was known for his propensity for violence and was a feared killer who also had control of the Brooklyn docks with his brother Tony. Albert Anastasia and a Jewish gangster named Louis Lepke Buckhalter, who was the leading labor racketeer in the country, were in control of the syndicate's enforcement arm called Murder Incorporated, which Dellacroce would become a part of. Murder Incorporated was a crew of mostly Jewish gangsters with a smaller Italian constituent, and they worked as contract killers for the National Crime Syndicate. They operated out of a candy store in Brownsville, Brooklyn, owned by a gangster named Louis Capone. Dellacroce started out as a hitman for Murder Incorporated and became a protege of Anastasia's. Dellacroce would be groomed by some of the most seasoned and vicious killers in the New York underworld. During its 10 years of operation, it's believed that Murder Incorporated committed over 1,000 murders, many of which were never solved. People often spoke of the deadly stare that Dellacroce possessed, as his gaze could send chills down a man's spine. NYPD detective Joseph Coffey said that Neil's eyes were so blue that it was like he didn't even have eyes, and he reminded him of the characters from the film The Village of the Damned. NYPD detective Ralph Salerno said that Dellacroce had the eyes of a killer and was one of the only mobsters to truly frighten him just by his look. Like his mentor Albert Anastasia, Dellacroce also had a reputation as a ruthless killer. It was said that he liked to look directly into his victims' eyes as he was killing them because he enjoyed watching their eyes go lifeless as they slipped into death. In 1951, the boss of the Mangano family, Vincent Mangano, disappeared and was never seen again. It's likely that he was ordered killed by Anastasia in order to take over the family. Anastasia then took over the reins of the Mangano family, and it would now be called the Anastasia family. Carlo Gambino would soon become Anastasia's underboss, and Neil Dellacroce would become a capo regime under the direction of Anastasia and Gambino. There was a faction in the Anastasia family headed by Armand Tommy Rava. Rava was a Gambino capo who had his hands in several different rackets, and Dellacroce would become his close ally. Rava headed a powerful crew, and some of the top members of his faction included Neil Dellacroce, Salvatore Tato Orello, and Johnny Roberts Robelotto. Johnny Roberts was suspected of being involved in the 1951 killing of an underboss in the Genovese family named Willie Moretti. Moretti, who was also Frank Sinatra's godfather, was gunned down by assailants as he ate lunch in a New Jersey restaurant. In the early 1950s, Dellacroce would meet a young thug named John Gotti, who was running errands for another Gambino capo named Carmine Fatico. John Gotti was carrying out hijackings at the Idlewild Airport. In 1954, Dellacroce got married to a woman named Mary Riccardi, and a year later his son Armand Aniello Dellacroce was born, named in honor of his close associate Armand Tommy Rava. By 1956, Carlo Gambino had set up court at a space at 247 Mulberry Street and named it the Ravenite Social Club as an homage to his favorite poem, Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. The Ravenite would be the main headquarters for the Gambino family for decades to come. On August 31st, 1956, Dellacroce was arrested along with two of his men during a roundup at the Ravenite Social Club. All three were arrested for vagrancy charges despite the fact that Neil had over $2,000 in cash in his pocket at the time he was picked up. Neil was also charged with criminal consorting with known hoodlums, and he was in illegal possession of a homemade 12-inch blackjack, and he was released on $500 bail. Dellacroce's arrest was the result of a police crackdown against the mob due to the backlash resulting from an acid attack on an investigative journalist named Victor Riesel, who was crusading against labor union corruption. After Riesel's assailant was shot dead on Mulberry Street just a block away from the Ravenite Social Club, the police were ordered to arrest anyone in the vicinity with a criminal record. On October 25, 1957, a major shift within the crime syndicate would occur when Albert Anastasia was shot dead by gunmen as he lay in a barber chair getting a shave. The plan had been set up by Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese as a power move to elevate both of them and their respective families, as well as to rid the syndicate of the unpredictable and brazen Anastasia. Carlo Gambino would be elevated to boss, and the family would bear his name from there on out and would be known as the Gambino family. He appointed Joseph Joe the Blonde Biondo as his underboss and Joseph Riccobono as his consigliere. After the killing of Anastasia, Neil initially opposed Carlo Gambino being appointed boss. Neil and other members of the Rava faction supported Tommy Rava to succeed Anastasia as boss of the family. Their other partner in the faction, John Robelotto, also backed Rava at first, but would soon switch his support in favor of Gambino. Shortly after switching sides, on September 8, 1958, Robelotto was shot dead on a Brooklyn street. But for Dellacroce, who was a true mafia loyalist who abided by the rulebook, family loyalty came first. Even though he was an ardent supporter and follower of Anastasia, Dellacroce was willing to swear his allegiance to Carlo Gambino and the newly found Gambino family. However, Dellacroce's close ally Tommy Rava didn't feel the same and rejected Gambino as boss. Rava had several crews backing him and planned a revolt against Gambino. Tommy Rava and his backers were the main opposition to Gambino, so Gambino took action.
Sometime around 1958, Tommy Rava disappeared while he was in Florida and was never seen again. There's varying accounts on who killed Rava, but one informant claimed that Gambino capo Tato Aniello is the one who shot him dead. After Rava disappeared, Gambino invited Dellacroce to a sit-down. After this meeting, any lingering acrimony between the two would be settled, and Dellacroce and Gambino would establish an alliance with one another. After Dellacroce's solidarity with Gambino and the disappearance of Rava, all resistance to Gambino's leadership had melted away. As one of Carlo Gambino's top lieutenants, Dellacroce was put in charge of overseeing various rackets for the family.
As the Gambino family expanded its influence, Dellacroce's reputation and respect had become momentous, and he was described as being capodecina de capodecina, which means captain over other captains. Dellacroce would also earn the nickname O'Neill because he once disguised himself in a Catholic priest's outfit and called himself Father Timothy O'Neill in order to gain entrance into the room of a man that he would assassinate. Neil's older brother Carmine was also part of the Gambino family. He had served a prison stint in the 1930s for beating a man with a hammer and had also been arrested for bookmaking. In the early 1960s, Tommy Rava's old crew was split between Dellacroce and another Gambino capo named Anthony Rizzo. Between Dellacroce and Rizzo, they had a number of people under them and were known as the Mulberry Street crew of the Gambino family. Another Gambino captain named Mike Cayaza would become Dellacroce's driver. To appease the IRS, Dellacroce was listed as an employee at the Royal Crown Bottling Company in Newark, New Jersey. This situation was set up for him by the company's president, a powerful executive named Martin Goldman, who was closely associated with Dellacroce. Goldman had helped Dellacroce and several other mobsters appear to have legitimate jobs, and he would soon be indicted for his involvement in extortion and siphoning funds for the mob. Dellacroce was called to answer questions about his involvement with Goldman, and he took the Fifth Amendment 18 times.
Dellacroce's ascent within the Gambino family would occur in 1965 when Carlo Gambino removed the aging underboss Joseph Biondo and replaced him with Dellacroce. This would make Dellacroce an even stronger member of the family who already had an unusual amount of power for a capo regime. Soon after this, news outlets dubbed Neil Dellacroce as the second most powerful boss in the United States behind Carlo Gambino.
Dellacroce was described as being similar to Gambino in that he was quiet and efficient, but unlike Gambino, who was a devoted family man, Dellacroce had a reputation as a womanizer and had fathered children with several different women. Dellacroce exerted major influence over the Brooklyn docks, which were once ran by Albert Anastasia along with his brother Tony. After Albert's murder in 1957, the Gambinos took over the docks and kept Albert's brother Tony on board. Dellacroce was also a key figure in a number of Teamsters unions around the country. On September 22, 1966, Dellacroce attended a meeting with 12 other top-level East Coast mobsters at the La Stella restaurant in Queens. Some major mob powerhouses were in attendance at the Stella meeting, including Carlo Gambino, Joe Colombo, Florida boss Santo Trafficante, and New Orleans boss Carlos Marcello. Authorities had caught wind of this meeting and raided the restaurant and arrested all 13 men as being involved in a top-level commission meeting. Dellacroce and the other men were charged with conspiracy and consorting with known criminals, and he was held on $5,000 bail. This meeting was dubbed the Little Appalachian Meeting as a nod to the 1957 secret gathering of dozens of high-ranking mobsters from around the country at Joseph Barbara's estate in Appalachian, New York, which was also raided by authorities.
The purpose of the Little Appalachian Meeting has never been clearly established, but one theory is that it was to discuss who would be the successor for the terminally ill boss of the Lucchese family, Tommy Lucchese. Whatever the reason, for all of those major figures to travel from around the country to meet in Queens must have had some major significance to organized crime. Dellacroce and several others would also be charged with criminal contempt of court for refusing to testify in front of a grand jury who was investigating the purpose of that meeting.
In July of 1971, a former Wall Street employee who described himself as a stockbroker for the Underworld became a cooperating witness. He had testified that organized crime was heavily involved in securities fraud and that Dellacroce had major influence over it.
On September 8, 1971, Dellacroce was sentenced to a year in prison for refusing to testify before a Manhattan grand jury who was investigating a mob takeover of a casino in the Dominican Republic. After a short jail stint, Dellacroce returned to the helm of the Ravenite. On August 1, 1972, a hoodlum named Carlo Lombardi stormed the Ravenite and fired 4 shots at Carmine Consalvo, who was the brother of Dellacroce's bodyguard. Lombardi was disarmed and beaten by the members in the Ravenite, but he managed to escape. Only a week later, Lombardi showed up to the Ravenite Club again, this time with a machine gun, and had tried to shoot Dellacroce, but the gun misfired and he took off. 10 days later, gunmen caught up with Lombardi in upstate New York and shot him dead while he was driving his car.
2 months later, Lombardi's getaway driver and childhood friend Joseph Fucillo was shot dead by 2 gunmen as he pulled out of the driveway of his Brooklyn home.
In 1972, Dellacroce was indicted on tax evasion charges for not reporting over $100,000 worth of stock that he owned in a company named Yankee Plastics. Yankee Plastics was a company that Dellacroce was extorting in order to keep peace with the Teamsters Union local.
Also in 1972, the rising gangster John Gotti had returned from a prison stint and was conducting business for the Gambinos from the Bergen and Hunt Fish Club in Queens. Gambino capo Carmine Fatico would be in charge of this faction that became known as the Bergen Crew.
1972 was also when John Gotti would meet an up-and-coming gangster who had recently defected from the Colombo family named Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gravano would be mentored by Gambino capo Toto Arello, the same man who was accused of killing Dellacroce's close associate Armand Tommy Rava in the late 50s. Dellacroce was highly respected in mafia circles. His stalwart character led people to refer to him as a man's man.
He kept the Manhattan faction in line where everyone listened to him, including the Bergen Crew members like John Gotti, his brother Gene Gotti, and Dellacroce's nephew, Angelo Quack Quack Ruggiero. By the early 1970s, Carlo Gambino's health had deteriorated and his trusted underboss Neil Dellacroce had taken over the day-to-day operations and members were reporting directly to him. Dellacroce's influence and clout had become so enormous that many considered him to be the second most powerful man in the underworld.